A faint hum filled Han Seo-jun's mind, distant, elusive, like an echo traveling through a vast, empty space. It wasn't the kind of sound he could recognize, yet it stirred something deep within him, a whisper from a memory long buried. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, gazing down at the city of Seoul, bathed in golden twilight. Below him, life moved relentlessly. Cars honking, pedestrians weaving through the streets, neon signs flickering in chaotic harmony. But inside his luxurious apartment, there was nothing but silence, save for the steady ticking of the antique clock mounted on the wall, a rhythmic, constant sound. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Seo-jun exhaled sharply and turned away. Something about that clock irritated him tonight. His phone vibrated on the marble counter. Park Jin-woo. He hesitated before answering. "Talk," he said, voice clipped. "Are you seriously still at home?" Jin-woo's exasperation bled through the speaker. "The investors' meeting is in an hour. I told you this is big. We need you there." Seo-jun pinched the bridge of his nose. Right. The meeting. The one he had already secured an agreement for days ago. "You worry too much. It's a done deal." "You mean you're not coming?" "Not necessary." A pause. Then, Jin-woo sighed. "Seo-jun, sometimes I think you enjoy making people nervous." He smirked but said nothing. The truth was, he was exhausted, mentally drained from the constant game of corporate survival. The business world was a battlefield, and he'd fought his way to the top through sheer force of will, ruthlessness, and an instinct for control. Control. It was the one thing he refused to lose. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. Another call. Choi Se-ra, his fiancée. Seo-jun stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "What is it? Is that how you greet your future wife?" Her voice was light, teasing. But he knew Se-ra well enough to sense the underlying irritation. "I'm busy." "You're always busy," she muttered, then quickly softened her tone. "Look, I know the meeting is important, but can we have dinner after? Just us?" Seo-jun closed his eyes briefly. He could already picture her perfectly, draped in an elegant designer dress, sipping expensive wine at a restaurant filled with Seoul's elite. They would sit across from each other, discussing surface-level matters, their conversation as rehearsed as any business deal. Se-ra was beautiful, sophisticated, and flawless in the eyes of high society. On paper, she was the perfect match for him. Yet, as she spoke, he felt nothing. "No promises," he said finally. She sighed. "Fine. Let me know." The call ended. Seo-jun exhaled, rubbing his temples. A dull headache had been pressing against his skull all evening, a persistent ache that refused to fade. He needed air. Grabbing his car keys, he stepped out into the cool night, the city unfolding before him in endless streaks of light. He drove aimlessly, the hum of the engine and the occasional blare of car horns blending into the background. The headache worsened. A sharp pain shot through his temple. He winced, gripping the steering wheel tighter. His vision blurred for a second, and then, a blinding flash. The screech of tires, glass shattering. The world flipped. His body lurched forward, the seatbelt digging into his chest. And then, silence. Everything went silent. A suffocating stillness surrounded him as he lay motionless, his mind caught between reality and darkness. He blinked, trying to move, but an overwhelming heaviness weighed him down. His ears rang. No, not rang. The ringing faded into something worse. Nothing. Absolute nothingness. Panic surged through his veins. He tried to swallow, to breathe, but the crushing realization hit him like a second impact. He couldn't hear. A dull pressure throbbed against Han Seo-jun's temples, as he drifted in and out of consciousness. The world around him was blurred, a haze of shifting lights and indistinct movement. He could feel the weight of his own body, the sharp sting of pain radiating from his shoulder, the tightness in his chest. But there was no sound, no distant hum of machines, no muffled voices of doctors, no rustling of fabric or the steady beeping of hospital monitors. Just silence. A chill ran down his spine, panic rising like bile in his throat. His fingers curled against the crisp bedsheets. His breathing quickened. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Seo Jun's eyelids fluttered open. The hospital room was dimly lit, sterile white walls surrounding him like a cage. A nurse stood near the bed, adjusting an IV drip. He parted his lips to speak, to demand answers. Nothing. His own voice didn't reach his ears. His heart pounded. His hand jerked up, gripping the nurse's wrist with sudden urgency. Startled, she turned to him, her mouth moving, saying something. But the silence remained. Seo Jun shook his head violently. "I can't hear," he said. Or at least, he thought he did. The nurse's lips moved again, her expression shifting into something he didn't like. Pity. His grip tightened. "I can't hear," he repeated, more forcefully this time. But the words remained trapped in the void, lost before they could even reach him. His pulse hammered wildly. A rush of dizziness washed over him. This isn't real. This can't be real. Just then the door opened. A doctor entered, his face serious, followed by a young woman Seo Jun didn't recognize. She was petite, her dark brown hair neatly tied back, her skin pale against the soft white glow of the fluorescent lights. Her eyes, deep and warm, studied him with quiet patience. She didn't speak. Instead, she raised her hands. Seo Jun frowned. Sign language. Something in his chest twisted violently. The doctor's lips moved, speaking to him, but his words were just empty shapes. He felt like he was underwater, cut off from the world. The woman, Lee Da-yeon, kept her movements slow, deliberate. "Hello, Han Seo Jun. I am your interpreter. My name is Da-yeon." His throat went dry. Interpreter? No. This wasn't happening. He turned to the doctor, ignoring her. "Tell me what's wrong," he said, or tried to. His voice felt foreign in his own throat, the vibrations meaningless. He only knew he'd spoken because he could feel the strain in his vocal cords. The doctor exhaled, his mouth forming words Seo Jun couldn't hear. Da-yeon began to sign again, but he snapped his head away, a sharp, jerking motion. No, he wouldn't accept this. The doctor placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to ground him, but Seo Jun shoved it away. He ripped the oxygen mask from his face, his chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. The world was closing in on him, the silence too thick, too consuming. And then, a sharp, searing pain exploded in his head. A gasp caught in his throat as his vision swam, black spots dancing in his periphery. He clenched his jaw so hard it ached. His fingers dug into the mattress, desperate for something, anything to hold on to. His body was betraying him. His senses were betraying him. A warm hand covered his own, soft, steady, grounding. Seo Jun flinched, his dazed gaze shifting toward the source. Da-yeon. She didn't pull away, didn't flinch when he recoiled. Her touch was impossibly light, yet firm, like she knew exactly how fragile he felt in this moment. Slowly, deliberately, she signed again. "You are not alone." His throat tightened. For the first time since waking up, he stopped fighting. And the silence, though still unbearable, didn't feel as suffocating as before. The silence stretched endlessly, an unwelcome weight pressing against Han Seo Jun's chest. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the suffocating realization that he had lost something fundamental. He lay in the hospital bed, his body still weak from the accident, but his mind was drowning in the quiet. The doctor had already explained everything, though he hadn't heard a single word of it. Temporary hearing loss, Dayan had translated with slow, precise movements. Recovery, uncertain. Uncertain. Seo-jun clenched his jaw. He didn't do uncertainty. A nurse walked in, checking his IV. He turned his head away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Every time someone looked at him now, it was with that same expression: pity, concern, hesitation. He hated it. A small notebook appeared in his peripheral vision. He shifted his eyes. "How do you feel?" Seo-jun stared at the neat handwriting, his lips pressing into a thin line. He followed the pen as it moved again across the paper. "If you need something, you can write it down." He exhaled sharply, snatching the pen from her hand. His movements were sharp, irritated. "I feel like hell." Dayan read it, her expression unchanged. She nodded, flipping to a fresh page. "That's normal. Your body needs time to adjust." Adjust? He didn't need to adjust. He needed to fix this. The door swung open and Choi Se-ra stepped in. Seo-jun immediately straightened, his expression hardening. Her fitted designer dress clung to her frame, her long, wavy hair cascading down one shoulder. She was effortlessly beautiful, the kind of woman who turned heads everywhere she went. But her eyes wavered the moment she saw him. She hesitated before stepping closer, forcing a smile as she spoke. Nothing. Seo-jun watched her lips move, frustration curling in his gut. He had spent years memorizing the way she spoke, the slight tilt of her head when she was being sarcastic, the way her lips pursed when she was annoyed. But now, stripped of the sound of her voice, it all felt foreign. She reached for his hand hesitantly. Soft touch. Cold fingers. He pulled away. A flicker of something. Relief crossed her face before she masked it. He didn't need to hear her to know she was uncomfortable. Dayan, still seated beside him, wrote something down and handed him the notebook. She asked how you're feeling. Seo-jun's grip on the pen tightened. He didn't want to talk like this. Didn't want to rely on someone else to communicate with a woman he had been with for years. Tell her I'm fine. Dayan hesitated for half a second before translating in sign language. Se-ra's lips parted, as if searching for the right thing to say. But the silence stretched too long, too awkward. She glanced at Dayan before returning her gaze to him, offering a tight smile. She spoke again, but he had already stopped trying to read her lips. Something in his chest twisted. She was distant. Not in the way that people are when they're worried. Not in the way they are when they want to help, but don't know how. She was distant in the way people already preparing to leave were. Seo-jun didn't react. He simply leaned back against the pillows, gaze unreadable. Se-ra lingered for a moment longer before she placed a light kiss on his forehead and left. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, he let out a slow breath. He didn't need to hear her words to know. She wouldn't last. Dayan waited a beat before pulling out the notebook again. Would you like to continue learning some basic signs today? Seo-jun let out a dry, humorless laugh. No. He closed his eyes, exhaling through his nose. This wasn't his life. It was a temporary inconvenience. He refused to let it be anything more. But deep down, as the silence continued to press in around him, a flicker of doubt crept in, and it refused to leave. Han Seo-jun had always been a man of control. He dictated the terms of his life, shaping his surroundings with sheer willpower. But now, stripped of sound, control had become an illusion. For 3 days, the silence remained. It was suffocating. Every interaction was frustrating. The nurses' mouths moved, but their words were lost in the void. The doctors brought charts, their explanations mere shapes in the air. Sarah texted him, saying she would visit again. Soon. He didn't reply. The only person who didn't seem thrown off by his silence was Lee Dayan. She arrived every morning, her expression calm, unwavering. While others hesitated, treating him like he was fragile, Dayan remained unaffected. She communicated with him like silence was normal, because for her, it was. Today, as she took her usual seat beside him, she pulled out a small notebook and wrote, "Are you ready to learn?" Seojun read the words but didn't react. Dayan waited patiently. When he didn't respond, she began signing anyway, her movements fluid and deliberate. "Let's start simple. Hello." She repeated the sign slowly, gesturing for him to try. He didn't move. Dayan didn't push him. She only wrote again, "Your brain is adjusting. The more you communicate visually, the easier it will be." Seojun exhaled sharply. Adjusting. The word irritated him. He didn't want to adjust to this. His gaze flickered to her hands as she continued to sign. "Hello." The motion was so simple. Just a small wave from the forehead. With a quiet sigh, he mimicked her movement. She nodded approvingly. Her praise wasn't spoken, but he felt it. Something about that made his chest tighten. Later that day, Seojun stood in front of the hospital window, watching as the city moved beneath him. It was strange, watching the world operate as if nothing had changed when everything had changed for him. A soft knock made him turn. Dayan was at the door, gesturing for him to follow. He hesitated. She held up the notebook. "Come with me." Seojun narrowed his eyes. He wasn't in the mood for more lessons, but Dayan simply tilted her head toward the hallway, waiting. Without a word, he followed. They walked through the hospital corridors, past sterile white walls and beeping monitors, sounds he could no longer hear. Dayan led him outside, where a hospital garden stretched before them. The air was cool, crisp with the scent of freshly cut grass. For a moment, Seojun closed his eyes, trying to find something, anything, to anchor him. Then he opened them, and everything felt different. Across the garden, a small group of children sat in a semicircle, their hands moving rapidly as they laughed. Seojun frowned. He couldn't hear their laughter, but he could see it, in the way their eyes crinkled, in the energy of their movements. Dayan gestured toward them. "They are deaf. They don't hear the world as you do, but they still live, laugh, and communicate. Sound isn't the only way to understand people." He swallowed. One of the children, a boy no older than 10, noticed them watching. He signed something quickly, his hands moving too fast for Seojun to understand. Dayan translated with a small smile. He says, "Do you want to play?" Seojun stiffened. He didn't belong in this world. He wasn't one of them. And yet, as he stood there, watching the children communicate effortlessly, a realization settled over him. He wasn't just without sound. He was without understanding. And that was far worse. For the first time since the accident, Han Seojun felt the weight of silence in a different way. Not as an absence, not as a void, but as something he had yet to understand. After the visit to the hospital garden, he had spent hours replaying what he had seen. The children, their easy laughter, the way they spoke without sound. He had thought his world had been shattered, but they were thriving. But that didn't mean he was ready to accept it. Seojun wasn't them. He refused to be. A sharp knock on the hospital door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned just as Choi Sarah stepped inside, her presence as poised as ever. Her dark brown hair cascaded in perfect waves over her shoulders, her tailored beige coat hugging her figure. She looked as if she had stepped out of a high-end fashion magazine. But her eyes, they wavered. Seo Jun straightened in his hospital bed. The silence between them stretched, far too long for comfort. She smiled, tight, hesitant. Then she spoke. He watched her lips move, her voice lost in the void. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Dayan, seated in the corner of the room, waited before pulling out her notebook. She asked how you're feeling. Seo Jun didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Sera carefully. There was a time when he could predict every single one of her reactions. When he could hear the exact tone of her voice, the slight lilt when she teased him, the practiced elegance in her words. Now, she seemed far away. He finally grabbed the pen. Fine. Dayan translated with quiet precision. Sera nodded but didn't step closer. She spoke again. Seo Jun's gaze remained sharp as he waited for the translation. She says she's been busy with work but wanted to see you sooner. He didn't believe that. If she had wanted to come sooner, she would have. Instead of answering, he motioned toward the tablet on the bedside table. A nurse had left it earlier, explaining, through written notes, that it had a basic speech-to-text function. Dayan activated it, and the device transcribed Sera's next words in real time. Once you recover, we can go back to how things were. Seo Jun's fingers curled into a fist. Back to how things were. He could feel it now. The distance between them wasn't just about the silence. It was deeper. Sera continued speaking, but he wasn't looking at the tablet anymore. He was looking at her. At the slight way her hands fidgeted. At the way her weight shifted between her heels. She was uncomfortable. Not because he was injured. Not because she didn't know how to communicate with him. But because she didn't want to. Because she was already pulling away. Seo Jun felt something inside him settle. A realization, cold and undeniable. She wasn't going to fight for him. And maybe he wasn't going to fight for her either. He reached for the tablet and typed out his response, watching as the robotic voice read it aloud. You don't have to stay, Sera. Her eyes widened. For a moment, she opened her mouth as if to argue. But then, just as quickly, she closed it. She wasn't going to fight at all. The silence between them said everything, and this time, it didn't scare him. The silence felt different now. Before, it had been imposed upon him, a sudden void where sound used to be. But now, it was the weight of something deeper, something that had existed long before the accident, a truth he had never known. Han Seo Jun stared at the photograph in his hands, his grip tightening. The young boy in the image, him, stood in front of an old orphanage, fists clenched, eyes filled with something he recognized all too well. Defiance. A familiar burn crept up his throat. He had spent his life forging a name for himself, building an empire from nothing. He had always believed he came from power, from lineage, from control. But this meant he had come from nothing. Across the room, Park Jin-woo sat quietly, watching him carefully. His best friend had always known, and yet he had never said a word. Seo Jun swallowed hard, his jaw tight. He grabbed the notebook from the bedside table and wrote with sharp, deliberate strokes. How long have you known? Jin-woo sighed. He spoke, his words forming on his lips, words Seo Jun couldn't hear. Dayan, sitting beside him, translated. Since we were kids, your father never wanted you to know. Seo Jun's hands curled into fists. Of course. Han Jun-sik was a man who built empires. He didn't inherit them. He created them. A son with no name, no bloodline wouldn't have fit into his perfect legacy. But why had no one told him? Why had this truth been buried for so long? The answer was painfully obvious. Because they didn't think he needed to know. Seo Jun let out a slow breath, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for the documents again. Birth records, legal papers, a history erased and rewritten. Jin-woo spoke again. Daeyeon's hands moved. Does it change anything? Seo-jun stiffened. Did it? He didn't know. His father had raised him, molded him into the man he was today. He had given him wealth, power, influence. But had he ever given him a family? A bitter chuckle left his lips. Jinwoo and Daeyeon watched him in silence. Seo-jun grabbed the pen again. I need time. Jinwoo nodded. He stood, straightening his jacket. With a lingering glance, he turned and left. The door clicked shut behind him. For a long moment, Seo-jun simply sat there, staring at the paper spread before him. Then, slowly, Daeyeon reached forward and picked up the notebook. She wrote carefully, her pen strokes gentle. You don't have to decide everything today. Seo-jun exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Then he picked up the pen and wrote beneath her words. I know. But deep down, he also knew. The choice would come sooner than he wanted. The hospital had become suffocating. Even in silence, Han Seo-jun could feel the weight of unspoken words pressing against him. Sera's visit had left an aftertaste, one of inevitability. She was already gone, even if she hadn't said the words aloud. And strangely, Seo-jun wasn't sure if he cared. He sat in his hospital bed, flipping through the notebook Daeyeon had been using to communicate with him. His own responses were short, clipped. Hers were always careful, deliberate. She never rushed. On one page, she had written, Your body will heal, but how you choose to move forward is up to you. Seo-jun exhaled sharply, tossing the notebook aside. He didn't need wisdom. He needed answers. Because something wasn't adding up. The dreams had started 2 nights ago. They weren't like normal dreams. They were vivid, visceral. A child's laughter, a soft voice calling his name. But the face was always blurred, the details slipping away the moment he woke up. It was frustrating. He had never cared much for his childhood. His parents were distant, his father a ruthless businessman who had expected perfection. His mother a socialite more concerned with image than affection. Seo-jun had built himself into the man he was without them. So why was his mind dragging him back? A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Daeyeon entered, a small messenger bag slung over her shoulder. Her presence had become oddly familiar. Quiet, steady, unmoving. She set the bag down and signed, Are you feeling better today? Seo-jun only shrugged. She sighed but didn't press. Instead, she pulled out her notebook, flipping to a blank page. You seemed deep in thought. Seo-jun hesitated before picking up the pen. Dreams. Daeyeon's brows furrowed. She gestured for him to continue. He hesitated. It was ridiculous to write this out. But he did anyway. There's someone in them. A child. I don't know who. Daeyeon studied the words carefully before responding. Maybe your mind is trying to tell you something. Seo-jun scoffed. His mind was the only thing he had ever trusted. He wasn't about to start doubting it now. But still, there was something unsettling about it. A soft knock interrupted them again. This time, it was Park Jin-woo. His best friend stepped inside, dressed sharply as always, but his expression was unreadable. He glanced at Daeyeon before settling his gaze on Seo-jun. Then he pulled out a folder and set it on the hospital bed. Seo-jun frowned, flipping it open. Inside were documents, photographs, old records. His eyes skimmed over them. Then he froze. A photograph of a young boy, no older than 6, standing in front of an orphanage. His small hands were curled into fists, his expression defiant, his dark eyes eerily familiar. Seo-jun's chest tightened. Jin-woo spoke, but Seo-jun couldn't hear him. So Daeyeon stepped forward, her hands moving slowly, carefully. This is you. The air stilled. Seo-jun's fingers dug into the edges of the folder. No, That wasn't possible. He had never been. His heart pounded in his chest, a sudden ringing filling his ears. Not real sound, but a phantom noise, a memory pushing to the surface. The laughter, the voice calling his name. Jinwoo gestured toward the documents again. Dayan translated. Your father adopted you when you were 7. Before that, you lived in an orphanage. Seo-jun's breath hitched. The walls of his carefully constructed life cracked. And for the first time since the accident, the silence around him was deafening. Han Seo-jun had spent his entire life making decisions with absolute certainty. Yet, for the first time, he hesitated. The hospital room was dimly lit, the city beyond the window stretching endlessly. His father had built an empire out of nothing, but that empire had not been his. It had been given to him, piece by piece, carved out of a life he hadn't even known existed. His hands hovered over the adoption papers, a truth buried for decades. A sharp knock at the door broke his thoughts. Seo-jun looked up just as Choi Se-ra entered. She was elegant as always, her tailored coat draping perfectly over her frame. But something in her stance was hesitant. She didn't belong here anymore. Se-ra's lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. But even without sound, Seo-jun knew what she was saying. She was trying to be gentle. She was trying to say goodbye. Dayan, seated in the corner, raised her hands to translate, but Seo-jun held up a hand, stopping her. He didn't need a translation. Se-ra hesitated before reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small, elegant box. His engagement ring. Seo-jun's gaze remained unreadable as she placed it on the table beside him. This time, she didn't even try to speak. She only gave him one last look, one that wasn't cruel, wasn't apologetic, just accepting. And then she turned and left. The door clicked shut behind her. Seo-jun stared at the ring for a long moment before finally exhaling. It was over, a soft sound, fabric shifting. He glanced at Dayan. She wasn't looking at him. Instead, she was neatly packing up her notebook and tablet, as if sensing that he needed space. But before she could stand, Seo-jun reached out, stopping her. She blinked, looking down at his hand wrapped around her wrist. Then he picked up the notebook. For the first time since waking up in the hospital, he wrote first. She was never going to stay. Dayan didn't respond immediately. Then slowly, she flipped to a new page and wrote beneath his words, "You knew that before she did." Seo-jun exhaled a quiet laugh. She wasn't wrong. There was a long pause. Then, after a moment, Dayan began signing again. "You're afraid that if you let someone else in, they'll leave too." Seo-jun's fingers tightened around the pen. His mind flashed to the image of the young boy in the orphanage, the boy who had been left behind. He swallowed hard, then looked up at Dayan. She was still here, and for the first time in a long time, Seo-jun felt like maybe, just maybe, the silence wasn't so lonely after all. The night air was crisp as Han Seo-jun stepped outside the hospital for the first time in weeks. The city stretched before him, bright, alive, filled with movement. But for him, it was silent. And yet, for the first time, he didn't feel lost in the quiet. Beside him, Lee Da-yeon walked at a steady pace, her presence as unshaken as ever. She had insisted on escorting him out, despite his protests. Now they stood together in the hospital garden, where everything had changed for him once before. A light breeze rustled the trees. Seo-jun could feel it against his skin. The world was still speaking, just in a language he had never learned to understand. Da-yeon turned to face him. "What will you do now?" she signed. Seo-jun took a slow breath. The doctors had cleared him for surgery. They had told him the option was there, a way to restore what he had lost. Se-ra had expected him to take it. his father would have demanded it. Even Jinwoo had subtly implied that the company needed him at full capacity. But Daeyeon, she had never once told him what to do. Seo-jun's fingers twitched at his sides. He had spent years believing he knew himself, that he understood his own desires. But now, standing here, he realized something strange. He didn't know what he wanted. Not really. Daeyeon's hands moved again. You don't have to decide tonight. Seo-jun exhaled, shaking his head. Then, slowly, he reached for the notebook in her hands. She handed it over without hesitation. For a moment, he didn't write. He simply stared at the blank page, at the emptiness of it. Then, carefully, he began to move the pen. Before the accident, I never really listened. Daeyeon tilted her head slightly. Seo-jun continued writing. People talked, and I heard them, but I didn't listen. He let out a quiet breath. Then, for the first time, he raised his hands. His movements were stiff, hesitant, but deliberate. With you, I learned to hear differently. Daeyeon's breath hitched. Her expression softened, but she didn't sign anything back immediately. Instead, she simply watched him, waiting. Seo-jun inhaled deeply, then took another step forward. And this time, he didn't need words at all. Instead, he lifted a hand and pressed it gently against his own chest. Then, he moved it outward, toward her. A simple sign, one she had taught him only days ago. I feel for you. The silence between them stretched. Not cold, not empty, but full. Daeyeon's fingers curled slightly at her sides. Her lips parted as if to say something, but she didn't. Instead, she lifted her hands. Slowly, softly. Me too. Seo-jun let out a quiet breath. For the first time in his life, the silence between him and another person didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like understanding. The city stretched endlessly before Han Seo-jun, bathed in the soft glow of the early morning sun. From the rooftop of the rehabilitation center, the world looked peaceful, silent, yet alive. For weeks he had been trapped in stillness, cut off from the world he once controlled with precision. But today, something was different. The silence no longer felt like a prison. Beside him, Lee Daeyeon stood quietly, her presence steady. A breeze tugged at the loose strands of her dark hair, lifting them against the backdrop of the city skyline. The urge to reach out, to tuck them behind her ear, was almost instinctive. Instead, he simply watched her. For the first time in weeks, he felt light. He had made his choice. The doctors had told him that his hearing could be restored with gradual rehabilitation. He had undergone the surgery, sat through the checkups, waited for the first flickers of sound to return. And yet, even as muffled noises began creeping back into his world, he no longer felt the urgency to chase them. Daeyeon turned to him, her dark eyes searching his as she signed carefully. How do you feel? Seo-jun exhaled, watching the gentle movement of her hands. He was still slow at reading signs, but he understood her easily now. He lifted his own hands to reply. Different, but not in a bad way. A soft smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It was a small thing, but it made his chest tighten. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise higher over the buildings. Below them, the streets of Seoul slowly came to life. People rushing to work, taxis weaving between traffic, neon lights shutting off as dawn claimed the sky. For years, this had been his world, fast-paced, efficient, loud. And yet, standing here now, he realized he had never really listened to it. He turned back to Daeyeon. She was watching the city too. But there was a quiet awareness in her expression, as if she were seeing something beyond what was visible. Seo-jun reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. the same one Dayan had used to communicate with him when he had first woken up in the hospital. He flipped to the last blank page and wrote something before turning it toward her. Dayan blinked, then took the notebook from his hands, reading the words carefully. "I want to keep learning." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with deliberate movements, she raised her hands. "I'll teach you. Always." The words, though silent, carried weight. Seo-jun let out a quiet breath, something deep and unspoken settling inside him. For so long, he had believed silence was an absence, something to fear, something that stripped the world of meaning. But now he understood. Silence was not emptiness. It was a different kind of language. And with Dayan beside him, he was finally ready to listen.